All right, Alexander, let's talk about what's going on in Lebanon. The country's problems just continue to escalate, and their currency continues to slide. Things are really bad in Lebanon on all levels, on the economy, civil unrest, uh, you know, uh, clashes in the streets, protests in the streets, uh, everything around the region. It's just all getting bad, and it looks like that Lebanon is sinking with each passing day. What's going on here?
I mean, it's a very bad situation. And can I just say, first of all, I've never actually been to Lebanon, but I have many Lebanese friends whom I'm very concerned for and for their families. And my family, my mother especially, had many connections to Lebanon and had been there. I went there, was extraordinarily impressed by the country, thought of it as a beautiful country, and has always been very concerned about its many problems. Briefly, the problems with Lebanon are partly economic, in that for a certain amount of time, the Lebanese banking system was basically and essentially run as a kind of gigantic Ponzi scheme, facilitated by the Lebanese central bank. That Ponzi scheme collapsed, bringing down the Lebanese banks with it. And at the same time, all of this has happened at the same time as Lebanese politics have become deeply fragmented and sectional, as the Lebanon's politics have increasingly become extremely sectarian in nature, and not just sectarian, but sectarian in the sense that various different religious groups have their own militias, their own essential warlords, and they are the true power in the country. Now, they have been blocking all attempts to carry out reforms in Lebanon. They have been blocking all attempts to set up a new government that could try and resolve some of these problems. They are resisting every attempt to try to carry out a proper audit of Lebanon's central bank. The result is the economy is spiraling downwards, and the result also is that Lebanon is in the grip of what is increasingly looking like an inflation crisis, which is evolving fast into a hyperinflation crisis. This collapse of the Lebanese economy is having an ever greater effect on the regions around it, because Lebanon was historically the banking center of this part of the Middle East. It's where the rich Saudis, for example, used to put much of their money. They used to put it in Lebanese banks. It's the collapse of the Lebanese financial system has essentially imploded the Syrian economy, and it's likely eventually to have greater repercussions for economies all around. So it's a very bad situation. But what is making it particularly difficult and particularly dangerous is that there seems to be no solution to it. There is no government. There is no prospect, it seems, of any government being formed. Lebanon has been essentially without a government for 7 months. And one has to worry that we are fast approaching the point of no return, in which case Lebanon, which had previously experienced a prolonged civil war in the late 70s and early 80s, could find itself again in similar armed conflict once more, with the country essentially fragmenting into its various different regions, and statelets, sectarian statelets, a Druze statelet, for example, a Shia statelet, a Christian statelet, all emerging with effective power and with the central government essentially no longer existing. So it is a very bad situation. It's not attracting the attention that it perhaps should do. And I would add something else. If Lebanon implodes in that way, if it fragments in the manner that I'm talking about, of course, in the Middle East today, as we know, there are powerful jihadi terrorist groups. They thrive on chaos and the collapse of organized government. Lebanon would seem to be an obvious place for them to establish themselves if they're driven out of Syria, as is looking increasingly likely, and now that they've largely been pushed out of Iraq. So I'm afraid many bad consequences from this affair, and a tragic one for Lebanon and for its people.
Yeah, can you broaden that out a little? What happens if Lebanon continues to slide and we get to that level? What does it mean for the entire region?
Well, as I said, first of all, one has to worry that this is going to create major problems in Syria, because, as I said, the Syrian economy, I should explain that once, not so long ago, Syria and Lebanon, when this region was under French rule, were essentially part of the same country. I mean, under the Ottomans and under the French, Lebanon and Syria were sort of governed together. It was the French who decided to carve Lebanon out of Syria in order to provide a region, a sanctuary, if you like, for a kind of Christian state within the Middle East, because France supported the Christian community, the Maronite Christian community in Lebanon, even though Maronites, by the way, are no longer a majority in Lebanon. So Syria and Lebanon are extremely closely integrated with each other. The collapse of Lebanon is causing a collapse of the economy in Syria, and the two are very closely interconnected with each other. But Lebanon was the banking region, the banking center of the entire Middle East. It's where rich, as I said, Middle Eastern people put their money. With the Lebanese banks now crashing, that is creating major pressure on other economies in the Middle East too, in Egypt, in the Gulf. And this is all happening at the same time as food prices are surging. And this is, an absolute perfect storm. It could result in major civil unrest in places like Egypt, places like Syria again, places like Lebanon, but also the Gulf too. So what happens in Lebanon has an immediate effect on the larger Middle East. And if we also see a collapse of of governmental authority in Lebanon, and remember, Lebanon at the moment doesn't have a proper functioning government, then with jihadi movements operating in many places, they could plant themselves there. They could go into conflict with Hezbollah, which is the Shiite militia that is based in Lebanon, which Israel and the United States and much of the West considers to be a terrorist movement. So we could see a spread of war and conflict through Lebanon across the Middle East at exactly the time when there look to be people in the Biden administration who are looking to restart conflicts in the Middle East also. So I think it's a very dangerous situation in Lebanon, because Lebanon is obviously serious and important for Lebanon itself, but because it has repercussions in the wider Middle East also.
Is there an element that much of this crashing of the Lebanese economy was deliberate from outside forces?
There might have been, in the sense that, the Lebanese state as it existed before this crash was becoming increasingly dominated by Hezbollah, which, as I said, is a militia group aligned very strongly with Iran. And of course, the United States and Israel are very hostile to Hezbollah and have been trying to basically break it up and destroy it. Israel sees Hezbollah as a major threat to itself, and it sees Hezbollah as a proxy for Iran. So there is that element too. So there may be some element of external destabilization of the Lebanese economy. But I have to say, a lot of these problems have their structural origin within Lebanon itself. It was the Lebanese, or rather not all Lebanese, obviously, but the Lebanese elite which increasingly ran the Lebanese banking system in this extremely unstable and corrupt way. And that was the proximate cause of this collapse. It would have come about anyway. If you recall, a couple of months ago, there was also that big explosion in Lebanon, near the port, where it turned out that warehouse was full of all those products that had been dumped from a ship, which eventually exploded. And this caused an enormous sense of shock around the world. That also partly reflects the weak and corrupt nature of the Lebanese government and the breakdown of its administrative structures, which have been an ongoing problem in Lebanon for a long time.
Is there a way that Lebanon can solve their economic problems? Or I mean, you don't have a government in place. It seems that they don't have the mechanisms at all to do. Can you simply just default and just reboot everything, or is none of that an option?
Well, in theory you could do, and if Lebanon functioned as a normal country, perhaps it would do. I mean, that's, it's always an option. You wipe the debts out, you default if you like, and then you start again. And it's happened. The problem is that Lebanon is such a divided place. Now, there have been protests. There's been large popular protests in Lebanon against the Lebanese government, the previous Lebanese government. There's been large protests against corruption in Lebanon. But these protests have never in the end managed to shake the essentials of the Lebanese political system, because that Lebanese political system is very deeply embedded in the sectarian nature of Lebanese politics. And that sectarian nature is backed by heavily armed militias. Hezbollah, for example, which is a militia, is more militarily powerful than the Lebanese army is. So that gives you a sense of how weak the state is. If you don't have a strong state, how can you carry out reforms? How can you change things? So I'm afraid Lebanon may be very close to that point of no return as a country. I mean, it makes me very distressed and upset to say that, but I'm seriously starting to wonder whether there's anything really that can be done now that can retrieve the situation. And it seems to me that some degree of political fragmentation within Lebanon, a kind of cantonization of the system, is now becoming increasingly likely, because I don't see any other way out. Popular protests don't change anything. There's no prospect of a strong government appearing that can change things. And power in Lebanon is not concentrated through proper conventional political structures, but is diffused in such a way that essential reforms or even policies are all but impossible.
All right, we'll leave it there. Alexander McCurse, thank you very much. Guys, make sure to subscribe to this channel, hit that like. It takes 1.5 seconds to hit that like, and it is absolutely free. So hit that like. Also look for us on Rumble, on BitChute, and on Odyssey. Please donate to us, PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribe Star. You will find those links down below. And go to the Duran shop. Pick up some merch, hoodies, sweatshirts, magic mugs. Our famous magic mugs as well.
Absolutely. Our famous magic mugs. This one with the flag of Australia. Alex is drinking with one from the flag of the United States. And please, as Alex said, come to our shop, find the great things there. Look us up on our other platforms. Donate if you can through Patreon, PayPal, and Subscribe Star. Check us out on our Discord server. And we look forward to you joining us in our next broadcast. And have a great day.
Take care, everybody.